Hi, everybody. My name is Bernadette Johnson. I'm Director of Advocacy and Knowledge Mobilization at Imagine Canada, and it's my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to everybody here. We're very happy to have you join us at this really important conversation about the future of the nonprofit sector's relationship with the federal government. We're at a really pivotal moment in this relationship presently, and we want to make sure that the sector takes this opportunity to really come together and define a good path forward together. So before we dive into that conversation, we'd like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge the physical spaces and lands that we're joining in from, even in this virtual format. Imagine Canada's staff, operations, work, and network depend on traditional Indigenous territories to provide us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community to work, live, and play. Our physical head office is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. We acknowledge that these lands are covered by Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge that these lands are still home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. We acknowledge that our ability to live and work on these lands today is a direct benefit of policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. The harms of these policies are many and are still being felt in Indigenous communities today. We express gratitude toward the Indigenous peoples who have and will continue to steward these lands. We commit to amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples and working against the everyday forces of white supremacy and colonialism present in the nonprofit sector. Our team is actively engaging in training and education related to reconciliation and decolonization. We aim to listen, to learn, to establish meaningful relationships with our Indigenous sector colleagues, engage in courageous conversations, and take actions that advance reconciliation in the nonprofit sector. As we're all joining in remotely, I'd like for us to take a short moment to reflect on the lands on which each of us are situated, the land that each of us is living on, working on, that's allowing us to join in as this virtual community today. So I'd like us to review some Zoom logistics before we get started. Today we're in a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar format. This allows for more audience participation, but it also means that things can be a little bit harder to manage on our end. Therefore, please stay on mute at all times unless you use the raise hand function, and I or Emily or Emmanuel recognize your name. If you forget to mute yourself, our team will mute you. It's nothing personal, just trying to make sure that we can keep the conversation moving and have a productive event. There will be opportunities to ask questions and share perspectives throughout the event. We strongly encourage participation. Please ensure that you use the raise hand function to indicate you're interested. If you prefer to share your thoughts using the chat box, feel free to do so as well. This meeting is being recorded, and you will receive the recording within a week of today, along with related resources. Closed captioning is enabled, and if you have further accessibility questions or needs, please let us know in the chat. So for a long time, the nonprofit sector has been dissatisfied with its relationship with the federal government and has called for decades now for a home in government. This has meant an entity in government that would be responsible for supporting and strengthening the nonprofit sector through policy, data collection, and other policies, similar to what we have within the Ministère de l'Emploi et de la Solidarité Sociale in Quebec. Currently, we have an opportunity to make this a reality with a small window. The federal government has expressed support for the creation of a home in government, and Imagine Canada is advocating for a consultation with the sector to determine the mandate, the principles, and what it should look like. The purpose of this event is to really excite and engage more people in big questions about the nonprofit sector's relationship with the federal government, and to think big about what our sector could accomplish if we did have the appropriate mechanistic support. And now we're going to hand over the reins to our moderator, Amanuel Melles. Amanuel Melles is the Executive Director of the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities. He brings 30 years of management and senior management expertise in various subsectors of the nonprofit sector: settlement and immigration, community health, social services and community development, and funding and sector capacity. Amanuel was on the senior management team at United Way Toronto and the Director of Programs and Capacity Building, where he led the development of the Organizational Capacity Building Unit and was responsible for leading the introduction of several innovative and creative leadership capacity building, evaluation, and granting programs aimed at building various capacities of nonprofit agencies and communities in Toronto. Prior to his role at United Way Toronto, Amanuel held various senior roles at Okazi, Lawrence Heights Community Health Centre, and Family Service Toronto. Over the years, he has contributed to the vibrancy of the nonprofit sector and communities as a board member, executive officer, and civic leader. Today, we've asked Amanuel to be an active moderator, drawing connections between the insights shared by our international guests and the Canadian context. Thank you, Amanuel, for agreeing to lead this very important conversation.
Thank you, Bernadette, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Sue Barker, who is joining us from New Zealand. Literally, she's joining us from the discussions about the future, from the future. It's the Tuesday morning there, and we're also excited to have Anna join us from Scotland, which is Anna and I are actually sharing the same day. We're still on Monday, and we're going to benefit a lot from the future insights of Sue. So I'm excited about this conversation. I think this issue of the relationship between the sector and government, and kind of drawing a comparative lens between Canada, New Zealand, and Scotland. The hope today is that beyond the three of us, the audience will actively participate in discussions, a collective reflection and learning that we're hoping to achieve. So I will take a moment now to invite both Sue, but maybe we can start with Sue and then go to Anna, in terms of really taking a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves, your work, and your perspective in general about this concept of home in government, and I think the overall relationship that your sector in New Zealand and Scotland is having with government. So Sue, we start with you.
Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hello everyone. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here with you today to speak about this very important topic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sue Barker. I'm the Director of Sue Barker Charities Law, which is a boutique law firm based in Wellington, New Zealand, specialising in charities law and public tax law. I have been practising in this area of law since last century. But for the last 2 years, I have been on sabbatical as the New Zealand Law Foundation International Research Fellow, Te Karahipi Rangahau, which I'm honoured to say was New Zealand's premier legal research award. The research topic was, what does a world-leading framework of charities law look like? Which I interpreted as, what might a world-leading framework of charities law look like for New Zealand, drawing on learnings from 5 comparable jurisdictions: Australia, England and Wales, Ireland, the United States and Canada. I would have loved to have looked more widely, but the research topic was corralled into those 5 or 6 jurisdictions. So I think there's considerable scope for further research in that area. The final report from the fellowship was released in April last year, making 70 recommendations for charities law reform in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In producing the report, my research assistant Tessa Vincent and I conducted consultation interviews with over 145 people from 9 jurisdictions. And some of you may be here today, and I would just like to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to all who gave so generously of their time and expertise. Thank you very much. The report includes a draft bill that would amend and restate the New Zealand Charities Act, basically so that we could see what the recommendations might look like in a tangible form as a starter for discussion. We circulated the draft bill to over 160 people from several jurisdictions, and the feedback received was absolutely invaluable. The final version of the draft bill incorporates the feedback received and has been included in Chapter 9 of the report. The report is 596 pages long. This is a copy of it here. So it's book length, and it purposefully does not include a summary because in my experience, these issues are complex, they're very nuanced, and the sound bites that they do charities a disservice. So I was encouraging people to read the whole thing and looking forward to discussions about its content. But that said, I was asked to contribute a chapter to a book entitled Governance and Regulation of Charities, International and Comparative Perspectives, which has been edited by Professor Rosemary Langford of Melbourne University in Australia, and which is due to be published in about 10 days on 16 November. Chapter 4 is entitled Designing an Optimal Charities Law Framework, and it's basically a summary of the Focus on Purpose report. So if any of you did have an opportunity to have a look at it, any feedback would be very gratefully received. In terms of my view on home and government, I do think it's critical. New Zealand has quite an unusual situation. We've only started the regulation of charities in a formal sense since 2005. So I have experienced life before the Charities Act, under the Charities Act with the Charities Commission, an autonomous Crown entity, which was a good 20 years in gestation, but it was controversially disestablished in 2012 and its functions were transferred to a business unit of the Department of Internal Affairs, or DIA, and registration decisions are ostensibly made by a charities registration board, Te Rata Ātawhai, which is statutorily required to be independent. But the problem is it's not resourced to be independent, and it receives its advice from the DIA, the business unit of the DIA. So what we really have is decisions effectively being made by a business unit of a government department. And this same government department gives advice to the minister. We do have a minister for the community and voluntary sector.
Okay.
But the advice is given by the DIA. So basically we have the agency that administers the legislation has just completed a review of the legislation, and its advice on its own proposals have been accepted by both the Minister and the Select Committee for the Community and Social Services Select Committee, apparently without critical examination. So I am very worried that we've had a good 20 years now of very piecemeal, knee-jerk reform that is not helpful for charities. It's actually increasing government control over charities, which I think fundamentally undermines its unique value. So sorry, I hope that didn't take too long.
No, that's quite interesting, and we'll come back to perhaps the proposed framework that you have could be of value to our discussion and reflection. Anna?
Hi, thank you very much. And please bear with me if I'm speaking, one, too quickly, and two, in a strange voice, because I'm just recovering from COVID. So please kind of bear with me on that. And I'm going to cough. So I'm Anna Fowlie. I'm the Chief Exec of the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. I've been in the job for 5.5 years now, but the organisation has been around since 1943. So I've been looking in the archives because it's our 80th birthday. And slightly to my horror, I discovered that some of the issues we're talking about in 2023 are still the ones they were talking about in 1943, including relationships with government. So that was quite salutary. But SCVO is the membership organisation for the sector in Scotland. That's charities, social enterprises and community groups. And we've got just under 4,000 members. We do a whole range of things that I'll tell you about in a minute, but the policy and influencing part of that work, working with government, we do on behalf of the whole sector, not just our members. So that's a bit of a balancing act to achieve. We've got 85 staff. We've got offices in Edinburgh, Glasgow and the Highlands, though all of our staff work in a blended way now, so we are kind of rethinking whether we need all those buildings. But we rent out space to other charities and voluntary organisations, so it's not just about our own staff, it's also generating income and creating a space for people to work together. And we provide a whole range of services. So we provide payroll, recruitment, HR, training, IT. We've got a funding search service that's updated daily. We've got a comprehensive information service for people about running a charity or a voluntary organisation, and lots of other specialised things like resources to help achieve net zero. We publish a monthly magazine and a daily online newsfeed. We even employ 3 journalists, which is quite interesting. And we run the biggest free-to-attend event for the sector in the UK, The Gathering, which is happening tomorrow and Wednesday in Edinburgh. And we also run the Scottish Charity Awards, and our members have access to pro bono services from lawyers and tax and finance specialists. Our funding comes from a range of different places. So we do get a core grant from Scottish Government, and we get grants for other specific topics. But the majority of our income comes from earned income through those services that I mentioned. In terms of the relationship that we have with government, I think we've got a really positive relationship with Scottish Government, but both SCVO as an organisation, but also the sector as a whole. I mean, obviously, 75% of the sector are small local organisations that are led by volunteers and are running playgroups or village halls and things, so they're not necessarily wanting a relationship with government, but we kind of do that on their behalf, and they have relationships with their local authorities, local councils. We've got good relationships with politicians from all parties, not just with government, those in power, and with civil servants. And as I say, the other infrastructure organisations within Scotland get funding from Scottish Government for core funding. But we also put different portfolios across government, engage with the parts of the sector that relate to them. So it could be social care, children's issues, homelessness, environment, the arts, sport, or whatever. They have their own relationships, and that's generally quite good. But there is quite a way to go in terms of parity of esteem with the public and the private sectors. We're working on that just now, and really trying to press the fact that the voluntary sector in Scotland is an economic actor and should be taken seriously as for its role in the economy, and no doubt we'll come on to that later. In terms of what Sue was saying, our regulator is a non-governmental public body, so it does report to a minister, but it actually doesn't. It reports to the Parliament, not a minister. But they have the same core team of civil servants that we deal with, but they are an independent regulator, so not kind of government, but not in government.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. And so I think there are quite similarities to some of the issues and challenge that we have here in Canada. I think it's so funny, Anna, how you said, some of the issues that we were looking into archives are similar today. I mean, it has been the same here in Canada. I mean, the sector has been advocating on a improved relationship with government for years, and there have been on and off studies and working groups. At one stage, we had the HR Council for the voluntary sector, the nonprofit and voluntary sector. That's no longer there. About 45 leaders from across Canada from the sector met in September, actually, meetings with various members of Parliament. One of the key things that we have been pushing is this concept of home in government. And it's also, I think, Anna, from your intervention, clearly you're positing the sector also as playing an important role in the economic life of Scotland. And then I think, when we talk about the sector and a renewed relationship with governments, if we are to move along in this discussion, perhaps, Sue, when you start thinking about the next 30 years, in terms of a vision of the relationship between our sector and national governments or federal governments and other levels of government. What do you see? What are some things that you see in this vision that we need to pay attention going forward?
Well, if I could wave a magic wand in 30 years, I would like for the charitable and not-for-profit sector to be seen and for its enormous potential to be understood and valued and unlocked. I use the term charitable sector to refer to a much wider portion of the not-for-profit sector than is currently the case in New Zealand, certainly, where the concept of charitable purpose is being interpreted very narrowly. And interpreting the definition of charitable purpose too narrowly is problematic in my view because it undermines charities. It causes them to be perceived as an old-fashioned, paternalistic, colonialist, Victorian concept of handouts to the poor, which perpetuates a deficits-based capitalist distinction between haves and have-nots that contributes to charities being seen as part of the problem rather than integral to the solution. However, if the definition of charitable purpose is permitted to be interpreted as intended, it is capable of focusing on strengths rather than deficits and addressing causes rather than merely symptoms, prevention rather than merely cure, and most importantly, allowing for self-determination. Communities know best what communities need. Correctly interpreted, the concept of charitable purpose is capable of embracing charities as key incubators of innovative solutions to intractable problems, devolving decision-making to those closest to the problem, and reaching into areas that governments cannot, encompassing hand-ups rather than merely hand-outs. And charities can help our societies address almost every critical issue that we face, including health, education, housing, rising inequality, poverty, climate change, biodiversity loss, social cohesion, public interest journalism, backsliding of democracy, etc., etc. I understand we are $7 trillion short of meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Governments simply cannot do it all on their own. It is essential to work with and unlock the potential of charities and other not-for-profits. However, as the late Dr. Lester Salomon so eloquently pointed out, the not-for-profit sector is the invisible subcontinent on the social landscape of most countries, poorly understood by policymakers and the public at large, encumbered by unnecessary legal limitations, and inadequately utilised as a mechanism for solving social problems.
Okay.
So my vision is that the charitable sector and the wider not-for-profit sector in which it sits is embraced as an equal and valued partner in addressing the complex social and environmental issues that we face.
Equal and valued partner. Thanks for that, Sue. And then you have listed a number of key things comparatively in terms of how we could see a different relationship in 30 years. Anna?
Yeah, I think we're going to have quite a lot in common here, just maybe through a different lens, because it's that respect and parity of esteem, I think, that really matters. But so when I saw that this was going to be a topic, I was thinking, 30 years, you're joking. The way things are in the world just now, it's hard to even think ahead. 5 years, never mind 30 years. And in terms of for Scotland, it also kind of raises the vexed, what we call the constitutional question, which is, will Scotland remain part of the UK? That's a whole webinar by itself, so I'm not proposing to get into that unless anyone wants to ask any questions about it. But it is, I think, what does matter to the sector really is that so far what we see is in UK government terms, it's different to Scotland. Whatever party's in power, they're not nearly as open to the sector as they are, as we have found with Scottish Government, again, whatever party's been in power. But you've offered the term vision, so I think that sounds more hopeful, doesn't it? Rather than it being all kind of doom and gloom, because I do hope the world's still here in 30 years' time. If it is, I'm pretty sure the sector will be. And my hope would be, similar to Sue, that government and all its agencies, the public as a whole, would see the sector as an equal part of the social and the economic fabric of the country, alongside the private and public sectors. We've got loads of warm words on that in Scotland. But in reality, the term third sector, which they like to use in Scottish Government, is just that. It's third. It's bottom of the pile. It's an afterthought, especially when it comes to investment. So in our sector, I mentioned being part of the economy. I've said that loads of times because I'm obsessed with it at the moment. But we're a country of 5 million people, but we employ 135,000 people across the sector, and there's 1.3 million volunteers as well. And we bring £8 billion to the economy every year. So that's more than the food and drink industry, for example. It's more than the tech industry. And we are in every part of the economy, from tourism, the arts, retail, transport, health, social care, criminal justice, the environment. I could go on and on and on. And you can test me on it. I bet you can't find anything that the sector's not part of. And voluntary organisations are providing essential public services. So for people with disabilities or mental health needs, but they're also protecting our heritage, our history, making our communities just better places to live, with theatres, art galleries, sports clubs, you name it. As I say, the sector's part of that, and I really would like that to be visible. But if the current trajectory of our public finances continues to be squeezed, then I'm not quite so optimistic. But I kind of think there'll be more reliance on the sector to fill in the gaps being left by the statutory sector. But there's also a lot of moves around community empowerment, community asset transfer, encouraging communities to take action, and communities not needing any encouragement, indeed just getting on with it, which is fantastic. And lots of local communities doing their own renewable energy generation, things like that. And the younger generation are interested in purposeful business. So I think social enterprise will grow. I think the sector will thrive. Things will have to be different, and some parts won't thrive, and we're going to need to accept that. But all of that means I think governments need to take the sector really seriously and invest in it properly, or create the conditions for others to invest in it, because it can't all be down to government. You said that yourself, Emmanuel. And especially not the funding. Government can't do everything, and it shouldn't. But it can create the conditions, and it does steer the public discourse. I think it's unfortunate that we always go to money first, and no wonder we're obsessed with viability. But recognition and respect are really important too. And if we had that parity of esteem, we wouldn't be in the position where we're so grateful to be seen by the government that would pretty much get used as free consultancy on working groups and things. And if we had proper investment, we wouldn't have to always be talking about money. We could focus on the big issues. And we would be delivering services because we're the experts in those things, not because we're cheaper or because there's a gap. So yeah, that's my. There you go.
Okay. So thanks for that, Anna. So one of the things that both of you mentioned is the word complex. Yeah. And I mean, Sue mentioned in regard to the report, the desire not to have a summary. It's just the issues are so complex and playing out in different levels. As I forge ahead in this conversation, I want to remind the audience that we would like to hear from you. Raise your hands if you want to interject and provide comments, or you could also use the chat to do that. And what I found really striking and similar is that these sectors, whether it's in our respective countries, are significant components, socioeconomic components of our countries. Here in Canada, Anna, we are at 13 million in terms of volunteers involved. Our sector, the nonprofit charitable sector, contributes more than 8% to the gross domestic product in this country. We have more than 2.4 million folks employed by the sector. It's significantly higher than many other sectors, economic sectors put together. So, and then you spoke about the desire to have equal and valued relationship. Like for me, I think here in Canada we have a number of issues that we'd like to see change down the road. Like we want to see funding reform, for example. We want to make sure that the funding practices of governments don't get in the way of innovation and creativity. We wanted to make sure that equity is central in terms of how we do our practice. In this country, we have significant segments of our communities, Indigenous, Black, racialized communities that continue to be on the periphery of life. Yeah, we would like to see a better focus on data and evidence, for example, not fronting the relationships through transaction and money and dollars, but first relationship. Yeah, and really recognizing this sector as an important component of building Canada, for example, here in Canada. So as we look at that, I wonder if each of you can take a moment and share with us what's working at the moment in your respective country that we should amplify and carry forward. If you could briefly comment on those, then we'll go ahead in our conversation. Maybe we can start with you, Anna.
Okay, thank you. I've just seen a really interesting point in the chat as well, but I'll let you decide what to do with that. So I think what's working well is the fact that Scotland is so tiny. It means that we kind of all know each other. So it's really easy to have a relationship with ministers and with civil servants. If you are in an organisation like mine, it's much harder for grassroots organisations, as we've said, but there are organisations like ours who can help, and many others who can help with that and do engage to make sure that people's voices are heard. So I think what works is that there's a genuine interest in community empowerment and community and the kind of optimism for the future in Scottish Government. They are slightly distracted just now by various things. However, the policy landscape is pretty benign around those things. Whereas what we see south of the border is a kind of lack of humanity and an actual antipathy to charities and antipathy to the people that they help. I mean, Sue mentioned that whole thing from Victorian times about the deserving and undeserving poor. We're seeing that raising its head in the Westminster government now, and it's just unbelievable. So, but we don't have that in Scotland, and we're lucky not. We don't even have that from the Conservatives in Scotland. It's like a different, it's a very different context. But we still work within that overall UK landscape. So I think what works well is relationships. What works less well is the transactional nonsense that they seem to do, like the way they do funding. The whole public sector does funding. It's transactional, short term. It doesn't encourage all that innovation and agility that both of you have talked about. And it doesn't kind of lend itself to prevention, even though we've got screeds of stuff, policy and legislation about prevention. It doesn't happen in real life, because we're too busy dealing with short-term, reactive, risk-averse policy making.
So?
Well, in terms of what's working well in New Zealand, I mean, we are also a small country. We have a population of about 5 million people. So we also have that sense that everybody knows each other. There's a saying here that everyone's within at least 3 degrees of separation from each other. And so it does mean that often you can have quite good relationships with ministers and politicians because, you might know them from a previous life. So a lot of charities and other not-for-profits do have a close relationship with decision makers, and they are able to speak the language of government and gain policy gains for themselves. And there've been some quite good, some individual charities and umbrella bodies have been able to score quite good policy gains for themselves. But this is reasonably ad hoc, and it occurs behind closed doors. In my view, we really need in New Zealand an organisation like Imagine Canada or SCBO, because we don't have anything like that. We do have a number of umbrella bodies that speak for parts of the sector, but we don't have anybody speaking up for the sector as a whole. And actually the Charities Commission was supposed to have that role. That was one of its key roles. And I think one of the real issues that's happened since the Charities Commission has been disestablished is that that role has completely disappeared. And I think we saw it most acutely. I don't know if you were aware of it. In 2019, we had a terrorist attack, a lone wolf terrorist attack on the mosque on 2 mosques in Christchurch. And following that, a high-profile charity, or it wasn't that high-profile beforehand, it received absolutely millions and millions in donations. It was overwhelmed with donations, and then it was crucified on social media because it wasn't getting those donations out fast enough as people perceived it. Now, of course, it was doing its absolute best in extraordinary circumstances, and all the money went where it was supposed to go in the end, as I understand it. But the damage that was done, not only to that charity, but also to the charitable sector as a whole, by this very negative narrative that was allowed to develop, I think was really critical. And I think it's really highlighted when you contrast it with Australia, because Australia has the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, the ACC.
Yeah.
Now, a similar situation arose after the bushfires, when I think they were 2020. I don't know if you recall, Celeste Barber said on social media, please help in any way you can, this is terrifying. And millions of dollars flowed in from all around the world. And again, 2 charities were absolutely crucified on social media because they weren't getting the donations out fast enough, because they can't, they're doing everything they can.
Yeah.
But the contrast with New Zealand is that the ACNC Commissioner, Gary Johns at the time, was on the front page of the Australian newspaper saying, don't worry, it's all under control, the money will get to where it's needed. And that ability to speak up on behalf of the sector, I think just, is critical, and New Zealand just doesn't have it.
I'm going to invite in a moment Emily, but I wanted to reflect in the discussion and important comments made by Brenda about the role of the small local nonprofits, and I think where in her words, where the rubber hits the road. I think the relationship among them is critical, and I think umbrella organizations such as yours, Anna, and many here in Canada, provincial and federal, are kind of the bridge and the capacity builder and connector out there. I also wanted to reflect the points made by Kate in terms of how we name ourselves, the nonprofit. I think the value proposition that we have, people start talking about the third sector or any other ways that we're referring. And her question is like, how do we appropriately serve our level of importance through the way that we name ourselves? So she suggested, for example, social profit. I want you to reflect on this in a moment. Jerry, I will come to you in a moment. If Emily, okay, let's go to Jerry and then I will come back to you, Emily. Yeah. Unmute yourself, Jerry.
Thank you very much. Again,
Jerry, sorry, if you could quickly identify your affiliation.
I'm a volunteer, a retired professor and advocate in the not-for-profit sector here in Canada, in Toronto. I've often used the following metaphor when describing the third sector, that if any one of those partners, whether it's business, government, or charity, removes themselves or is disregarded in that relationship, then we all know from experience that a two-legged stool does not stand. And I think we have to assume some of the responsibility for that, because we are so polite, so kind. Again, I heard hands up instead of hands out, which is, I think, a more proper description of what it is that we're doing. I spent most of my life in the education sector, and have spoken to many about how not to treat it as an expense, but rather as an investment. Because if you didn't have the education system, I leave that to your imagination. We often use the phrase too of social infrastructure. And we recognize the value of the connections that we make in our communities. So let's forget a little bit about being so polite, so kind. You're not looking for a fight. You're not looking for an argument, but you are pressing a case. You're pressing an issue. The charitable sector is not an expense. It's an investment. Let's keep that stool stable.
Jerry, thank you so much for crystallizing that, not an expense, but an investment. I've always said in my work with my peers that to move away from this transactional relationship that Anna was also referring to earlier on, that we are partners in solution with governments, yeah. And I think for government to recognize us as real partners, they need to really go back and revisit the value that they give us. Some of the comments made earlier on. Brenda is, I will come to you in a moment. So Brenda is just saying like a common term that's increasingly being used these days is social purpose organization. That includes nonprofit charities, social enterprise, and social purpose businesses. Sue?
I was just wondering if I could respond to Jerry's point.
Please, yes. Reflect, if you could reflect, and then we can go to Anna. Go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, Jerry, thank you very much for those comments. If you did have a chance to read the Focus on Purpose report, that's exactly what I've said. In my view, it'll just take me a couple of minutes to articulate it, but I'm just going to try if I could. But in my view, there's an underlying clash of paradigms that permeates this area of law. And one paradigm sees the tax privileges for charities as a subsidy, more or less equivalent to a direct grant. And on that basis, charitable funds come to be seen as government funds, and government seems to feel that it has the, or certainly in New Zealand, and I can only speak for New Zealand, it feels that it has the obligation to direct how charitable funds are spent because they're basically government funds in its view. And I know, but this is the paradigm that is currently dominating New Zealand policy regarding charities, that you are basically an extension of government and government gets to tell you what you can do and what you can say. And in my view, and in the report, I talk about how this is the way that charities are perceived in China and authoritarian countries, which exploit charities for community service delivery while heavily restricting their role in civil society, their ability to advocate. And the other paradigm, in my view, does not see the tax privileges for charities as a subsidy, but as an investment in an overall system that allows us to manifest important democratic principles such as social tolerance, freedom of expression, freedom of association. And what I'm arguing in the report is that we need to resolve that underlying clash of paradigms rather than just assuming.
As Sue joins us, maybe we can't hear you, Sue. I don't know if that's the case for everyone. Can you hear Sue? No, Sue, we can't hear you, Sue. We can't hear you. As Sue tries to reconnect, maybe Anna, can I invite you to comment? Yes, we can hear you. Go on.
So in my view, what we should do is actually examine that underlying assumption. Are the tax privileges a subsidy, in which case we continue to regulate charities, or is it an investment, in which case we might look to create a more enabling framework that allows charities to further their charitable purposes as they see fit without undue government interference. And that's basically what I'm arguing for.
In your framework. And I think we have similar discussions and concerns here in Canada in terms of how governments, through their funding instruments, whether it's grants or contribution or other ways, are either enabling or actually creating more headaches for the sector itself. Anna, any comments on the points that Jerry made? And if you can, John also brought up the idea of expanding the relationship, not just thinking about the non-profit charitable sector and government. What about businesses and others that are actually doing work?
Yeah, and I think that can happen quite naturally. There is a tendency within government to think they're the ones that have got to engineer that. So I think we have to take some responsibility for that ourselves as well. But we don't have that whole thing that if you pay your tax, that is almost seen as getting a grant. That no doubt it'll come, but I've not heard that. But there is an argument around some charities, and I mean charities rather than other voluntary organisations, who are providing things like social care, where their entire funding comes from, well, they might have the odd, ball or something to raise a bit of money, but it's mainly from government contracts, or actually local government contracts, where there is an argument that actually, are they just a local government department? Is there, there's a bit, we have what we call arm's length organisations, ALIOs, which would be leisure trusts and things like that in Scotland. And there's a bit of an argument, are some big social care charities basically just ALIOs in disguise? I would say they're not, but that is a discourse that's happening just now. But the benefit is that they can use, I think, whatever size of organisation, they can use what they do in terms of their work and their service delivery to inform their advocacy work. So it's based on actual evidence of what's happening on the ground, and that combination of those two elements is really useful. So, but yeah, I do think there should be more kind of places where all sectors come together, and we shouldn't be quite so obsessed with this, maybe we're the only ones that are, but I suspect not. I think that you probably don't get it so much in the public sector because they don't see themselves as a sector, they see themselves as local authorities, education, social work, health, whatever. But probably where us and the private sector are a bit like, well, nobody understands us, nobody cares about us. Really? Is that, how true is that? Let's, maybe we need to be a bit more grown up about it.
So let's build up on this conversation, and maybe Sue, if you can comment, what do you think the government in New Zealand's responsibilities are at the moment towards your sector, and what isn't it doing that it should be doing? Is there anything that you think that the government should be doing in relation to the sector?
I would like to see it make a commitment to this equal and valued partnership. And I think to that end, I'd really like to see a civil society strategy, because there's a lot of activity, a lot of ministers make decisions that touch on various aspects of the sector, but it's not coordinated. And how can we get to where we're going if we don't have a vision for how to get there? In terms of the idea of a civil society strategy is not for government to set an agenda that civil society should be setting for itself, but rather to articulate a vision for how best to unlock the potential of the charitable sector and the wider civil society in which it sits, thereby reducing its invisibility while also respecting and enhancing its independence and autonomy. And such a purposeful and overarching strategy would guide policy development and help protect against harmful regulation and piecemeal knee-jerk reform, which is what we've seen over the last 20 years, just steady encroachment and steady erosion of charities' rights. So I think we've just had an election, we've had a change of government. We still don't actually know who our minister is because there's quite a large interregnum period. So I would like to see a real change in the relationship between charities and government in New Zealand.
Okay. Anna?
Yeah, I think that was the opposite of Sue for once. This is so we've just had a new deal for local government and a new deal for business, and of course now our minister's saying, "Do you want a new deal for your sector?" And we're saying, "Not really. We just want you to actually do the stuff that you said you would do, because otherwise civil servants will spend months writing another strategy and not actually doing the stuff that they said they would do in their previous strategies." But that's because we're in a good position with the previous strategies, which you're not in New Zealand by the sound of things. So I just kind of think it's a way to kick stuff into the long grass because they love writing a strategy. They just love it. But it's different from acting. And I would like to see more action, I think, at the moment. And I think when I was thinking about this topic too in advance, I was thinking, I was trying to compare it to something that I could understand in terms of the federal versus provincial government. And obviously we don't have that. But my comparison would be probably with how we sit with the UK government. So we're a devolved nation. A lot of things in Scotland have never been at a UK level. They've always been at a Scottish level, like education predates the union of the parliaments and all of that. So, and Scots law has always been different. Not that some people would remember that, but most things are devolved to Holyrood, apart from most tax, the big bits of social security, foreign policy, immigration and defence. Everything else is devolved. But what we've seen in and Westminster shouldn't be getting involved in anything else. However, since Brexit, we've had a thing called the Internal Market Act, which is a kind of Trojan horse that's basically opened the door to interference So, but sometimes, so they are now getting into turf that that should be seen as part of the Scottish Parliament, but they're also bringing money with that, bypassing Scottish Government, but bringing funding, the levelling up agenda as it's called, and they're dealing directly with councils. And that's a real double-edged sword for our sector. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, but also they'll want you to take sides and will not be doing that. So the UK government just now is on a real mission to preserve the union. So having ignored Scotland and Wales for decades, they're now love bombing us with visits and ministers and, you know, buildings and Union Jacks a go-go and money. And it looks like we will have a Labour government next year, but they're equally dedicated to preserving the union. So I'm not sure that anything much is going to change, except we'll have a government, hopefully, that's actually got a bit of compassion and humanity, which would be at least a change. So I suppose I think there's probably something to learn, but I think that it's not a comparable situation. How it works in Canada with how it works in the UK.
I hear you. Quite a complex picture there. Emily, and then I'll also interject with some comments. Emily?
Yeah, I wanted to interject with a comment from John Lilly in the chat, which I think is quite relevant still to the discussion. And his question is, should any federal government act creating a federal department include all agencies, businesses, and governments who deliver programs, provide volunteers, or support in other ways that are commonly known as charitable activities? So basically, I think the sense is many parts of the government are connected to the government or are connected to the sector and serve nonprofits and charities in different ways. So how do we make sure that all of those aspects are covered within a home and government?
Yeah, and I think some of the comments made in the chat kind of reinforce, I think, the point that Sean is raising about something like Imagine Canada, you know, designing a draft structure, proposed mission and dynamics to invite the feds. There have been a lot of efforts in the pipeline so far to try to really put forth the idea of a home in government, to kind of redefine and strengthen the relationship to one of value and equity, so to speak, with the federal government. And here in Canada also, we have provincial governments that have also a different type of relationship with the sector. So depending on which province, I think there are different levels of relationship. I think we have here the advisory committee on the charitable sector that made that recommendation about home in government. We have a Senate legislation and intervention there that recommended, home in government. There is momentum here. I think the key question is how do we, some of the comments made in terms of really a fulsome relationship that focuses on not only the nonprofit charitable sector, but the sectors that are providing solutions to society. Anna and Sue, to what extent the role of the nonprofit charitable sector in your respective countries, the view that society has, to what extent is that influencing the relationship that you have with governments?
Government are influenced by what the public thinks, but the public are also influenced by what government thinks. So I think there's different narratives. So at a UK level, particularly in England, there's a current narrative around sort of anti-woke, charities are all lefty do-gooders and blah blah blah, and it's quite tiresome. We don't experience that in Scotland at all yet, which is good. And the public, when our various surveys are done, the public in Scotland always have a more positive view and more trust in the sector than in other parts of the UK, but it's always higher than it is of other sectors in all parts of the UK. So there's I think what the issue is that the public think of charity as charity shops or food banks or the animal protection, or the big things. They don't really see their own local village hall as a charity, even though it is a voluntary organisation. They don't necessarily see the local community transport service. They don't see the local grassroots football club. They don't see the Scottish Ballet or whatever. They don't necessarily see those things, and they don't see the sector as a whole. So I think it's a bit like saying, what do you think of local government? Everyone can't stand the council, but they love education and they love social work. So, do you know, I think that it's quite hard to work out what the public attitudes are specifically. But there's a high degree of trust, a higher degree of trust in the charitable sector in its widest sense than there is in the other two sectors in Scotland.
Okay. So?
I think there's the media narrative in New Zealand is actually quite hostile to charities, and I agree with you, Anna. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship, and it feeds into getting worse policy, and getting worse policy feeds the negative narrative. And I think there's something of a perfect storm in New Zealand, because the current structure housing the charities registration function within a business unit of a government department effectively sends a message to the rest of government and also to the public that the charitable sector is not seen as important, that it's just a little thing off to the side. And couple this with the very restrictive registration environment, that is actually really having an impact on preventing charities from speaking up for themselves, because they fear that any advocacy will see them deregistered. And there's also a significant problem of unintended consequences of piecemeal changes over the years, which has resulted in an agency which really does not have sufficient accountability for the important power that it wields. And you mentioned, Anna, that that OSCR reports to Parliament, and in my report, I've recommended that whatever agency administers the charities registration function, it must report to Parliament. But currently we have a couple of lines in a 200-page annual report that covers the Department of Internal Affairs work across a whole range of areas, from censorship to passports to anti-money laundering to gambling, you name it. So there's absolutely no meaningful accountability for the exercise of the registration function, or meaningful input into policy. And I think that's a significant issue, because not having a home in government in New Zealand means that decision makers receive advice from only one source, the agency that's actually ministering the legislation that they're advising about. And this is what I think having a significant impact in leading to ever increasing regulation. And of course, the media is under significant financial pressure, which creates incentives for it to focus more on clickbait, scandal kind of stories than good news stories about the important contribution the charitable sector makes. And this creates the environment, this creates a hostile environment that really makes it doesn't contribute to an informed and nuanced public understanding of the importance of the charitable sector, and it's creating this hostility. And I never thought I'd see it, but the media narrative is hostile to charities in New Zealand, which makes it almost impossible to try to get good legislation. And because it's all about generating the conditions necessary to get the political will, because there's no votes in it now. Actually doing something to create an enabling framework for charities is not going to get votes. So I was talking to the person who I hope will be the Minister for the Community and Voluntary Sector once this interregnum period is finished. And I said, we can't wait for it to come from the charitable sector. The charitable sector is depleted. It can't speak up for itself. It's got no policy capacity. It's absolutely struggling. Charities are closing. We need someone to lead. We need you to lead, Minister to be. So please create an enabling framework for charities. Anyway, you've got to keep trying, don't you? But what worries me at the moment is that the charities law framework is being weaponised against charities through overreaching exercises of regulatory power in the name of promoting public trust and confidence. And charities appear to be likely to be lauded not for the good work that they do, but for the politeness of their consent to their own demise. So in my view, what needs to happen here is that government needs to invest in the sector and get out of the way. That's what I'd like to see.
And thanks for that, Sue. I think there are a lot of interesting comments in the chat. I think there's a different perspective about starting to think about solutions outside of government and outside of the box. I think there's no shortage of resources. I think there is concern expressed about you know, do we need to get our acts together, because ourselves, we are so many in terms of the number of players and being fragmented and having too many players. Do we need to improve our communication and engagement with governments? Some of the comments in the chat. So building on this conversation as we head towards the third question, we started this conversation by, you know, framing the importance of home in government, and that is placed differently in all these three countries. I think there's a recognition that there's value for that, but also that this has been going on for many years in terms of interest from the sector, and nothing concrete has happened as yet. So Anna, in Scotland, given your experience there, if you could talk a little bit about the concept and value of home in government, but also if you could speak a little bit about, do you see any difference in terms of the work that you're doing and the issues of small and rural community-based organizations in Scotland as opposed to those in the urban centres?
Yeah. So it's just we start off with the home in government. We do have a home in government. So we have a unit within Scottish Government of civil servants. It's very small, it doesn't have much money, but it is a unit called the Third Sector Unit. And that's where our funding, where the funding we get from government comes from them. They also look after charity law and making sure that ministers in other policy areas are briefed about things to do with the generic sector interest. We also have a lead cabinet minister, so the cabinet secretary for social justice, Shirley Ann Somerville at the moment. What's really helpful to us is, apart from the fact, of course, we know her because we do. She has worked in the sector. Her husband currently works in the sector, so she really gets it. And I know that she sticks up for our sector within cabinet. She's good at identifying when there's unintended consequences or when they might be thinking that something doesn't involve the sector or not realise it does. She will chip in and point it out. And she's very publicly vocal about the importance of the sector. And she's good at kind of prodding her cabinet colleagues about things. So that's really helpful. And what it means for me is, with both the civil servants and the minister, I've got an open door that I can text the minister, I can phone her. Civil servants, I can say what's going on here. She will phone me and say, I just want to test this out. What do you think? Before she kind of exposes it to the public or her colleagues in government. She always phones me before the programme for government is announced and before the budget, and then afterwards. Just to sort of give you a heads up, and then to say, I know you'll be disappointed this wasn't in, but here's why. And actually, it's really useful. So the current ministers and civil servants really, they know that we will be noisy and that we will criticise them. And they accept that, and they know that's in the interests of our members. And it doesn't damage the relationship at all. So I think what it comes down to is relationships at the heart of everything. But you need to know who your relationship's with. And when you're looking at the sector as a whole, you can't build it with every single policy portfolio. It's really helpful to just have that. So we have relationships with other ministers, whether it's health or the First Minister even, or whatever, the economy minister, but our key person is the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, and we know that, and she knows that, and that makes it much clearer.
And Anna, in her case, is she holding a cross-ministerial responsibility? Is there a table, or you channel the energy, the engagement through her office across ministries? How does that work?
It works well with her directly through her office, or with the civil servants in the Third Sector Unit.
Okay.
So, and they work for her, and her remit is bigger than just our sector. Obviously, she's got local government and she's got social security, so she's got a massive remit. But actually, that's also helpful because it means that she understands all of those things. I mean, it would be different if there was a rubbish minister, but she's a good minister.
Okay. Okay.
So you mentioned the rural and island stuff as well. Sorry.
Yes.
I'm from the Highlands in Scotland, so I'm a bit kind of obsessed with how central beltist we are. There's an assumption that everything is like it is in Glasgow and Edinburgh in Scotland, and I know it is not. And particularly the island communities are very different. So what we have in every local authority area is what's called a third sector interface. So that's like a little version of SCVO, and they represent their sector within their local areas. They work together as well, and they work with us. But for example, in the Western Isles, there's several little interfaces on all the islands, and they get together. In the Highlands, there's others as well. So they have their own representative mechanisms within their own local areas.
Okay. Sue, the same question to you, but as you reflect on that question, can you also share what New Zealand's approach has been in terms of the Maori experience and Indigenous organizations in terms of the work that the government is doing there?
Yes, well, I did prepare something about the relationship with Māori and other Indigenous organisations, because just briefly, when I was at law school, I was taught that there are 3 ways to take over a country. The first is you can be the first to arrive and put your flag in the soil. The second is you can fight for it and take it over by defeating the incumbent. And the third is to negotiate for it. And that is the approach that New Zealand has taken. We, in 1840, signed the Treaty of Waitangi between the Māori chiefs and the British Crown. There are many difficulties with the treaty, and we certainly have had our own process of colonisation, etc. And one of the key issues is reconciling the 2 texts, actually, the English and the Māori versions. But some argue that the fundamental principles of the treaty are partnership, protection, and participation. So for all its faults, the treaty is an important event in New Zealand's history. Following the signing of the treaty in 1840, the Crown sought to obtain Māori land by 2 key methods. One was by acquiring it legally, and the other, sadly, was by just taking it, raupatu, or confiscation. And there were many breaches of the treaty which have resulted in significant and deeply felt grievances over generations. And so this broad process of colonisation and removing people from their land has ultimately resulted in the statistical overrepresentation of Māori in prisons, unemployment, domestic violence, and every negative statistic you can think of. But there were 2 significant events, 2 significant pieces of legislation. One was creating the New Zealand Māori Council, a pan-Māori advocacy body, and the other was the creation of the Waitangi Tribunal in 1975. And that's a forum for Māori to take their grievances about breaches of the treaty to a forum. It's not binding, but it has resulted in many settlements over the years. Particularly over the last 30 or so years, successive New Zealand governments and Māori have negotiated a number of settlements for breaches of the treaty. There are probably about 100 or so settlements that have been passed into law now, comprising several billion New Zealand dollars, with further settlements still pending. And, you know, it's not a perfect process. There are still lots of difficulties, but the settlements are said to have utterly transformed New Zealand and to have set into motion major change drivers which are expected to strengthen over time. The Māori economy is growing and diverse, with an asset base as at January 2021 of almost $70 billion in value. And we have the Māori charitable sector. A lot of the settlements had to be given to a charity. So Māori in early settlements would set up a charity to receive and administer the settlement funds. And their mandate is to grow this base for their future generations. The Māori charitable sector is thriving and growing. And so that's one thing that made me think about self-determination, that if we interpreted the definition of charitable purpose properly, because we hear a lot of complaints from Māori that this definition is colonial, it's old-fashioned, you are stopping us from helping people into businesses, from providing social housing, from providing handouts, from supporting, you know, people who look like they might, you know, achieve well in golf or whatever. And my argument is, actually, it's not the definition of charitable purpose that's wrong. If you interpreted the definition of charitable purpose properly, you would be able to further your charitable purpose as you see fit, subject to the requirement for comprehensive transparency and accountability disclosure on the Charities Register. And from my research, I would say that New Zealand has the most comprehensive set of transparency and accountability requirements for charities in the world. And I would argue that the Charities Law framework should be about accountability, not regulation. It's not about the state second-guessing your decisions as to how to further your charitable purposes. It's about, yes, we've agreed these purposes are charitable. You go and further them how you see fit, subject always to the general law. You know, there's criminal law, there's tax law, there's anti-money laundering law, all of that, subject to the law, subject always to the terms of your constituting document. It's for you to determine how to further your charitable purposes. And I think that if we could do that, I don't think Māori would see the definition of charitable purpose as colonial. They would see it as empowering and strengths-based and enabling them to further their charitable purposes as they see fit. So that's what I would like to see. I mean, there has unfortunately been a backlash in New Zealand. When Jacinda Ardern came into power in 2017, she was very focused on this idea of partnership between the Māori people and the rest of New Zealand. And we were all learning te reo. Te reo is the Māori word for the Māori language. And she was, you know, encouraging us all to be able to kōrero in te reo. And it was actually going really well, I thought, but it just went too far. And there was all this controversy about co-governance, because the thinking is that Māori know best how to solve their own issues. And we have what's called whānau ora, where, you know, Māori communities look after the health of Māori families, the whānau, the wider family. And it's devolved to those closest to the issues to provide Māori solutions for Māori issues. And it works really well. Whānau ora has been a huge success, and it's not a threat to anybody. But we've now had a Māori health authority, and it's now received a backlash that it's apartheid, and that whether you get health is going to depend on what the colour of your skin is. And sadly, I think it's really fed into the change of government, and they're still working out the coalition arrangements now, but one of the parties who's going to be in the coalition is very strongly against this idea of co-governance, which you know is going to be interesting where it all lands, because somehow we have to work out how to give effect to the treaty, so that basically I think the ultimate goal is that everyone in the country has the opportunity to reach their own potential. And I think the charitable sector can be a huge part of that. And I don't think spending millions of dollars stopping it from doing that is a good use of money, but it's a matter of getting the ears of those who can make decisions.
And so definitely, I think even here in Canada, the relationship between the sector and such a diverse and varied sector and the issue of our Indigenous brothers and sisters is complex. And I think, as you mentioned, in your case in New Zealand, the Treaty of 1840, here in Canada also we have different and several treaties that govern the nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous Canada and non-Indigenous Canada. There are some of the comments that Kate made in the message in the chat about there are some good pieces of work underway. I mean, the work of trust-based philanthropy. We have not taken a lot of time in this conversation to delve deeper around the philanthropic or foundation sector in terms of its contribution and lessons learned. But there are some great things in the pipeline, includes developments in trust-based philanthropy. Foundations really been open to invest in a different way, recognizing that they have a huge capacity in terms of assets, but also influence in the sector itself. I think the complexity of the relationship that we have in Canada between governments and Indigenous communities and others, as you know, here we have gone through a very extensive truth and reconciliation process through a commission led by a commission, and the sector itself, as sector leaders, we have as treaty people that obligation to be able to really not only learn and be aware, but also act as diligent allies in trying to find trying to support the self-determination and solutions that Indigenous leaders and communities seek in this country. totally another deeper conversation around the relationship between the sector and its placement, if you want, in advancing and supporting and fighting anti-Indigenous racism here in Canada and across the world. We're coming close to the end of our conversation slowly. We started again this conversation with a focus on home in government. Definitely, I think there's some advances and lessons to reflect from Scotland. Sue, briefly, what's getting in the way in New Zealand of having a home in government? What's really getting in the way? You have touched a number of issues, but what would tilt this in favor of a home in government in New Zealand?
I think what happens is that once you've given a government agency reasonably unbridled power, they're very reluctant to relinquish that power. And I think in a democracy, it's so important that there are checks and balances on the exercise of power. But if you don't have that and an agency can aggrandize themselves and create this really very the centre of unbridled power, it's really hard to undo that. So they basically hold all the strings. They advise the minister, they manage the minister's diary, they provide the policy advice to the select committee, so that everything is determined by this business unit pretty much of a government department. There's no ability really for charities to have meaningful input into that policy. So we used to have a home in government. We used to have the Office of the Community and Voluntary Sector, but that was disbanded in 2013, just after the Charities Commission was disestablished and everything was moved to DIA. So everything is in DIA. It's a very, very big department. It knows how the system works. It knows how to dominate the narrative. It knows how to, you know, do kind of lip service consultation. And so I don't think we're going to get any improvement in the situation for charities until we get a better structure that allows for contested policy advice and to get decisions made that actually have the interests of the charitable sector at heart rather than just the interests of the department. And I say that you know, having been through a 5-year review process where I was a member of the core reference group, so I've been intimately involved. I've seen the whole process from woe to go, and that is the problem. And I did just have one thought on the definition of the sector, because we've had that issue come up from time to time. Is it the third sector? Is it the charitable sector? Is it civil society? Is it the not-for-profit sector? Is it the community and voluntary sector? Is it the tangata whenua community voluntary sector? Is it the social service sector? And what I wrote in the report is that I think the fact that there's this diversity of idea as to what we should call the sector is a reflection of the diversity of the sector itself and something to be embraced. I don't think we'll ever find a name that actually accurately captures the full diversity of the sector. So I'm kind of just comfortable with, you know, all these different names. Yeah.
And thanks for that. And similar comments were made earlier on by Brenda in the chat. I think here in Canada, there is, as I indicated in the opening remarks, there is momentum around pushing for a home in government. There is reception at the government level. I think the challenge for us as sector leaders in Canada is to try to connect the dots. It's trying to really work across all our subsectors and sector leaders and trying to really, as indicated in the chat, improve our communication and engagement with the government and irrespective of the government of the day, to try to really make the value proposition for a home in government in Canada. Any quick and closing remarks from you, Anna and Sue, and then we'll pass it to Emily for wrapping up this session.
No, I was just about to put in the chat that I'm very happy to make connections between Imagine Canada and the people in Scottish Government, if that would be helpful. Politicians and civil servants, you might hear it from the other side, from their perspective, about give you a sales pitch to give to your people. So no, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I say I'm with Sue. Don't get into the whole terminology thing. When I first started in this job, I opened up that debate, and my colleagues all went, "Don't." And we kind of stuck with voluntary in our name because we've already got the initials and because it was the least hated of everything. I know that in kind of England and Wales there's a bit more towards voluntary voluntary and social sector, I think, or voluntary social and community sector. But as soon as you start listing things, you miss somebody out. So I don't think you should do lists, because there's always someone who goes, oh, we're not in there. And the voluntary, for our perspective, is about the governance. It's about people who are volunteers, who are the trustees of, whether it's a social enterprise, whether it's a community group, whether it's a big charity. They're volunteers that are the trustees, and that's the voluntary part of it. But I think this has been, I knew it would be interesting. It's so interesting as well, hearing from for people from New Zealand and Canada, where you've got the kind of Indigenous people's perspective, when we're obviously the ones who did the blooming colonising in the first place. So we're kind of looking at it through that lens. And yeah, it's salutary experience to hear it from you're so close to it and so on the ground with it. I find that quite emotional. So thank you for introducing me to that.
I hear you. So quick remarks before we wrap up.
Well, I would just like to say, if Canada does have a window where you have an opportunity to get a home in government, I think that's really exciting. And then if you manage to do it, you will set a precedent for other jurisdictions. New Zealand certainly looks to Canada. And if anyone had a chance to have a look at the report, you'll see I've gone into Canada in quite a lot of detail, because we were following Canada until you started getting good law, like the advocacy law, then we stopped.
Okay.
And so I would say the way it seems to work is that, there has to be a chorus of voices. So it's so important. I mean, I would say from the outside, if you have this opportunity, please come together and please speak with one voice and please advocate for it, because it's strength in numbers. If ministers and politicians are getting letters and all this noise from everywhere saying they'll make it just to make it all go away, so good on you, and I hope it goes well. I look forward to seeing hopefully a home in government in Canada soon.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for those powerful words, Sue and Anna. Both of you, thank you for joining us in this important conversation today and sharing your knowledge and expertise. I also want to thank every member in the audience that has shared their thoughts and participated in the discussion. I would like to thank Imagine Canada for continuing to express the system leadership that we need in this country, in holding the space for all of us to have this type of important and necessary conversations. Thank you so much, both of you. And I'll pass it back to you now, Emily, to close up the session.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. And thanks again to Sue, who is joining us super early in the morning, and Anna, who's joining us in the evening and with COVID. So thank you so much. Thank you also, Emmanuel, who's joining us at the time most of us are in. But we really appreciated this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and all of your expertise, your experiences with your respective countries. We really just want to say that to everyone in the audience, the federal government has indicated that it is supportive of the idea of creating a home in government. So now we have to kind of make them actually do it. So we're currently advocating for a consultation process about how a home in government should be structured, what it should do. And it'll be really crucial, if we get that consultation process, that the whole sector get involved, and so that we can really design a structure, a body that serves the sector well and makes a meaningful difference. So our call to action after this session is really to stay involved in this file, to follow the news on it, and if there is a consultation, to get involved. You can stay up to date by following our weekly newsletter if you'd like. I've dropped the link in the chat already. And as a couple people have asked, there will be a recording to come by email within the next week or so. And there will also be a few other resources in there with just more information about this topic. So thanks again. Thanks to everyone who's shared things in the chat. Thanks to Emmanuel, Sue, and Anna. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your Monday or Tuesday, as it may be. Bye, all.
Thank you so much.
Very much.